All right, great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Meet the Experts session on policy and regulatory issues. My name is Jonathan Purtle. I'm an associate professor at the Drexel School of Public Health in Philadelphia, and I'm joined today by my co-expert, Dr. Peter Littlejohns. So I just prepared a handful of slides for context about policy implementation research as I think of it. I'll share these slides. Peter also has a handful of slides that he will share. Given the format of this session being Meet the Experts, these aren't formal presentations. We just want to provide some context and open it up for questions. So myself and Peter are going to focus on politics a little bit and the role of politics in policy within the context of implementation science or dissemination and implementation research. So I just want to share a few kind of overarching macro thoughts and three figures, some pictures for you all today. So first, I just want to start by emphasizing, as all of you probably recognize, but I think this can get lost when thinking in an implementation science sort of way, that policy making is political. So this is a wonderful quote from a woman named Carol Weiss, who was a researcher who thought a lot about the use of research evidence in health and education policymaking in the US. And she has this quote: "The policymaking process is a political process with the basic aim of reconciling interests in order to negotiate a consensus, not of implementing logic or truth. The value issues in policymaking cannot be settled by referring to research findings." And I think this is a wonderful quote that rings more true today than ever before. And I think it just, when thinking about implementation science and public policy, we cannot purely approach this as a technical enterprise. It also has to be a bit of a political enterprise, and we have to take politics into account if we are going to effectively infuse research evidence into policy decision. So I want to share a few thoughts about the role of context in policy-focused dissemination and implementation research. I would say that considering context is one of the key features of implementation science. At the end of the day, it's about doing things in real-world settings. So we think about context a lot. But I would argue that in implementation science, we kind of have a clinical bias, if you will, when thinking about context. So this is, this varies by study, but just in general, I would say this is how context is often thought about, levels of context are thought about in a typical clinical dissemination and implementation research study. So the intervention in the middle is some sort of evidence-based treatment that has demonstrated effectiveness. The adopters are people like clinicians or leaders in health organizations. The inner context are things like the implementation culture, implementation climate, and organizational culture in that health organization. And then policy is kind of just this outer vague thing. And there's recognition that, of course, policy influences what goes on in clinical counters, absolutely, but it's more vague and it's on the outside. But when policy is the focus of an implementation science study, as it's the focus in my research, all of the stuff about context flips a little bit. So the intervention is some policy, and at best it's evidence supported. The notion of evidence-based policies doesn't really make sense in the policy context because we're not randomizing people to policy contexts. So the best we can have is a policy that we think is aligned with evidence or evidence supported or evidence informed. The adopters are actors that are operating in political contexts. So these could be elected officials like legislators, they could be executive branch, administrative policymakers, but they're operating in a political space. And that political space, closest to them, I consider it to be the inner context. So these could be the politics going on in a state legislature or a local city council, or it could be the agenda of the governor or the executive branch or administrative official in charge. And then outer context gets way far out there, and I think often gets beyond what we think about being typically the domains of implementation science, but I'd say it's absolutely relevant when policy is the focus of the implementation science research question. So things like public opinion around an issue, media coverage of that issue, are all important outer contexts that influence decision-making in policy making in health. I just want to give a very, very quick example of kind of how I've kind of thought about this in a research way, focusing on public opinion. This is a very, very broad study, and in many ways, it raises far more questions than it answers. But I was curious, we talk about, the importance of evidence-informed health policymaking and evidence playing a role in health policymaking. And from the world of political science, we know that public opinion does matter for policy. Policymakers do actually act in ways that are usually aligned to at least some degree with the interests of their constituents. So I wanted to know what the public thinks about this idea of using research evidence in policymaking. So I was broadly focused on quote unquote health policy development in US Congress. So very broad, very general. But I asked two things. I just want to share these results. So I asked respondents the extent to which they thought that these different factors, which I'll show you, should have a lot of influence on health policy making in US Congress. So here these results are dichotomized. These are the people who said 4 or 5 on the 5-point scale. So evidence. The public, at least they say, they want evidence and citizens' desires to have a lot of influence on policymaking. Of course, this raises the question of what happens when evidence and citizens' desires are in direct conflict, as they often are. But it was interesting to see evidence pop up right there at the top. What don't they want to have a lot of influences? Pretty much all the other things I asked about. So the desires of doctors, considerations about budget impact, and pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies. So then I also asked these same questions, but I flipped the question. So instead of asking what they thought should have a lot of influence on health policy making in US Congress, I asked what the extent to which they thought these factors do actually have a lot of influence on policy making in US Congress. And we see the inverse. They think evidence has very little influence and that private interests, pharma and insurance companies are driving decision making. And when you plot it, it looks like this, the inverse relationship of dissatisfaction. So I just offer this as an example of how I've thought about public opinion in outer context within a policy-focused implementation science sort of way. And the so what from all of this is thinking about how we could potentially harness the power of public opinion to push policymakers to make health policy decisions that are more aligned with the evidence. And just two more quick things. Policymakers are often talked about in just very general terms. What do policymakers think? And I think it's important to remember that policymakers are an extremely diverse bunch of people in the capacities in which they work and just as individuals and their values and the values of their constituents. And I think it's important to remember that, a one-size persuasion or dissemination strategy is unlikely to be terribly effective because there are so many different types of policymakers and how they think about different issues in different ways. So I just want to give another quick example from my research. So my focus is on mental health and public policy in the US, and I'm focused on state legislators. So these are people elected to the state level across the 50 US states. There are about 7,500 state legislators in the US. We did a survey of them, 475 of them replied. And the goal was to just use this method called latent class analysis to see how their opinions about behavioral health issues cluster together and identify different quote unquote audience segments of state legislators. And we found that 3 pretty different segments of state legislators exist, at least 2 very different segments. So the biggest group was this group that we called budget-oriented skeptics with stigma. So these legislators, we asked them about the role that they thought the different considerations should have in policymaking. And this group was all about the finances. They really cared about budget implications when making decisions, much more so than evidence. They were skeptical because we asked about their thoughts about the potential effectiveness of mental health and substance use disorder treatments. And they were very skeptical that those treatments could have much impact at all. And they also had the most stigma, the most negative attitudes towards people with mental illness. So we asked a few stigma items, and this group had the most stigma. Then on the far right, we found this other group of action-oriented supporters. This group is action-oriented because these are the people who are introducing mental health and substance use bills in their state legislatures. They prioritize these issues. They say they care about evidence, and they also think that treatments can work. And then we have this group of passive supporters, which is quite similar to the action-oriented supporters, but the main difference is they don't prioritize mental health and substance use issues, and they're not introducing bills. But they also say they care about evidence, and they also believe the treatments can work. So this is just an example of kind of how we've thought about the heterogeneity of policymakers from a research perspective, and thinking about how this could inform how we disseminate mental health evidence and substance use evidence in different ways to different types of legislators. And lastly, I think it's important to note that context is changing. And by that, I mean, people have been studying the use of research evidence in policymaking and how that can be improved for at least 50 years. But the world is changing rapidly. And I think, the focus has long been on how to get more evidence into policymaking and how to infuse it into decision-making processes. But now we have this huge problem of scientific misinformation, this notion of a post-truth society, less and less trust in research evidence. And now I think we have a whole other can of worms, thinking about how do we not only get evidence in, but also how we get misinformation out. And in the context of COVID, especially in the United States, I'm not sure of the degree to which in the UK as well, but I'm sure you know what's going on in the United States. There is so much misinformation, and in many states that is driving policymaking, and that's a huge problem. So this is just a question I throw out there for as we move forward. It's not just about getting good evidence in, it's about debunking myths and misconceptions that are not aligned with evidence, perhaps are aligned with citizen desires, but does not result in the policies that has the best health. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Dr. Peter Littlejohns.
Okay. Okay, I think the screen, I'm just trying to get it to, no, I think I'll continue. I think you've got a complex screen, sorry about that. I'm just going to give a very brief overview of some of my experience because it'd be good to get some of the questions. So I'm South London. And just to reinforce what we've heard already, the concept of evidence being sacrosanct is never the case. It's always a contested concept. And there are many historical perspectives. This is from Nietzsche that said there is no such thing as facts, only interpretations. And as Jonathan has said, that means that policy is, you can never actually have evidence-based policy. You can only have evidence-informed policy. And it's probably a sterile argument to have that debate between science versus politics. You just have to. If that's the case, then when difficult policy decisions are being made, those that lose out will be exceptionally uneasy, positively upset. And what is required is a due process to ensure that those who are involved in the debate feel that they have a clear hearing. And for 12 years, I was the founding clinical public health director at NICE, and I'm delighted that NICE is following us in a few minutes. And these are some of the rather bizarre quotes when NICE said no to interventions. So what was required is a robust technical process to assess clinical cost effectiveness, a values framework so that you can understand the ethics. But increasingly, as Jonathan has emphasized, there is a requirement to look at the political perspective. And we did a global study comparing how different countries approach this. And basically, what was required was to form, address, I need to have a look at this paper and again, of course, a particular aspect that I was very much upset by. Dr. Fauci, very eminent position, as you can see, has provided evidence to many presidents and has been a very respected academic for many years. And as you can see, the quotes, when the politicians feel uneasy with the evidence, they can personalize it. And I think one of the issues that we have to address, and Jonathan again is really, we can do that in a way that is acceptable to the public and to politicians and to academics. I'll finish there and we can now take questions. I'll stop sharing.
So it's not a large group. So if you have a question, you can unmute and just pose your question and show your video if you like, or you could put a question in the chat box and then we could answer it that way.
I could keep on talking.
Well, I have a question for Peter. Is that okay? Peter, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so I'm just curious. You know, in the U.S. when I was you know, learning about health policy, NICE always seemed like the best idea ever from a U.S. perspective. It just seemed very much from the outside like a way to enact health policy for a nation that was more immune to politics than the way we go about it in the US. It seemed like a structure where evidence was built in to play a much stronger role. And my question from you, in your experience, me being someone who knows very little about NICE and had that conclusion, and you and someone who lived it, and what you see going on in the US and has been going on in the US, do you think that's true? Do you think the structure of NICE and does kind of protect it from politics in a lot of ways that other health systems designs do not?
Yeah. Well, I won't steal the thunder of my colleagues or that are coming afterwards, but it was set up as a political entity by Tony Blair's incoming Labour government, and it basically reinforced the view that there should be equity and fairness across the NHS. And nobody can disagree with that. So the underlying policy was accepted by everybody, especially by politicians, because they established it. But it did build on the back of a strong evidence base through the Cochrane collaboration, evidence-based medicine, Oxford, the NIHR, which was then the NHS R&D program. So it was a coming together of a willingness to have a political understanding of how to achieve things with an acceptance of the evidence. And I think what NICE was in a position to do was to act as that conduit between the world of politics, the public world of experience, and the research world. But what it needed was a fair process, and we may hear a bit more about it later. And that built on very much Norman Daniels' concept of accountability for reasonableness. But at the end of the day, like-minded people can look at the same evidence base, come out with different answers. But what you need is a framework to do that. And I think that's what NICE did very well, linking the evidence with professional opinion and patient involvement.
Thank you.
I was just going to ask a question, if that's all right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very interesting the kind of contrast between the approach you both have in terms of the US context and the UK context. And you obviously, Peter, talked about the kind of start of NICE and where that's come from. Do you think that the world is the context for implementation has changed over the last, I guess, 20 years that NICE has been going? Because you talked about consensus. And again, Jonathan, you talked about consensus as, you know, in terms of people's kind of buying in as a society. And do we think that's kind of fractured in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so?
I think the answer is, and I can talk obviously UK, but not the States, but There has been a reluctance to talk in terms of value for money, cost effectiveness. Ironically, when the money gets tight, during the Blair period, when there's all this discussion, the NHS had its biggest expansion of resources in its history. Then post 2008, massive decrease because of the international financial crisis. But the politicians, you're right. I mean, the politicians were less easy talking about rationing, and we've seen it with COVID right across. The concept that whatever it takes will be achieved, whereas there's very little discussion around prioritizing healthcare or prioritizing healthcare interventions with education, with financial systems to support people into work. It's that level of debate is not there.
Yeah, we see the same thing in the U.S. And this notion of whatever it takes, and kind of ignoring concerns about budget impact, even though those are very real constraints at the end of the day. So for example, through the Affordable Care Act, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI, was created. And the whole point of PCORI was to inform, CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and kind of help decide, we have 6 treatments for the same thing. Let's compare them. Let's see which ones work better. Let's see which ones patients prefer, and do the one that's the best. But in the mandate that created them was a mandate that they could not consider cost effectiveness whatsoever. And they will fund no studies that you can't put a dollar sign in your proposal or you're done. And that was extremely clear. And I think that there's this interesting idea of whatever it takes, but in reality, there are very real budget constraints and limited resources, but we like to ignore that when it comes to healthcare and decision-making, or pretend to ignore it.
Can I just ask a question? Because obviously, I'm interested in the US context, because it feels like it's the perfect environment for natural experiments in terms of the different levels of government and how things are done. Whereas we constantly yo-yo, I think, in the UK, we struggle a bit about what we do nationally and what we do locally, and struggle about that idea about allowing local innovation. Whereas the US, you have that much more built into the system, isn't it? It's ingrained.
Absolutely. So, Medicaid is a great example. So states have tremendous leeway to craft their Medicaid program for low-income individuals who are not elderly. It's a great opportunity for natural experimentation, and a lot of great quasi-experimental studies are conducted, and we learn a lot. The interesting thing is, Medicaid policymaking is so political, though the impact of the evidence from those studies may not always have the most uptake, even though it's good evidence, and the natural opportunity for natural experimentation allowed for such evidence to be produced. Some states it has influence, other states it does not, just because Medicaid, it is so political, these state level decisions.
So you have the evidence, but you have to have the right politics to go with it as well, is it?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But I mean, with COVID, it's a great example. I mean, states have responded so differently in their rules related to opening and mask wearing and everything you can imagine. And tons of evidence is coming out from these opportunities for natural experimentation, which is good in many ways. I mean, I think in the COVID context, that evidence is having, again, in some states, but not all, having a lot of influence. So yeah, for example, with mandates around wearing masks, there have been some well-designed quasi-experimental studies that produce some good evidence that I really feel like in Pennsylvania, where I live at least, informed policy and requirements. Okay. So I believe we're at time.